There are moments in life that feel too ordinary to matter. A Saturday afternoon. A drive through town. The kind of day where nothing seems urgent, where time moves slow and easy, where the world feels predictable. And then someone vanishes. In the spring of 1985, in a small coastal community in Florida, two people disappeared during what should have been the happiest time of their lives. They were newlyweds, barely into their 20s, full of plans and promises. They left behind questions that would hang in the air for more than 2 decades. Questions that would outlive marriages, careers, even the people who first asked them. This is a story about what happens when time doesn't heal. When silence becomes its own kind of violence. And when the person responsible is someone no one expected. Before I reveal how a single decision, made in quiet desperation more than 20 years later, finally brought the truth to light, go ahead and subscribe. These stories are told to make sure the truth doesn't disappear with time. Now, let me take you back to a Florida town that believed it was safe. Brevard County, Florida, in the mid-1980s, was the kind of place people moved to for peace. Not the glamorous coastline of Miami. Not the theme park chaos of Orlando. Just small beach towns, fishing communities, and neighborhoods where people knew their neighbors' names. The kind of place where you could leave your door unlocked. Where kids rode bikes until dark. Where strangers waved from their cars. It was April 1985. The air was warm but not yet suffocating. The ocean breeze carried the smell of salt and sun. Spring flowers were blooming along quiet streets. Life felt simple. Daniel and Patricia Mitchell had been married for less than 3 months. They were young, Daniel was 23, Patricia just 21. They'd met at a church social 2 years earlier. Friends said they were inseparable from the start. Patricia had a laugh that filled rooms. Daniel was quieter, steady, the kind of person people trusted without thinking about it. They got married in a small ceremony in January, surrounded by family and a handful of close friends. Patricia wore a simple white dress. Daniel couldn't stop smiling. They moved into a modest apartment in Cocoa Beach, just a few blocks from the water. Daniel worked at a marina, handling boat repairs and maintenance. Patricia had just started a job at a local florist. They didn't have much money, but they had plans. They talked about saving up for a house. Maybe starting a family in a year or 2. They were building something. On the morning of April 13, 1985, they woke up early. It was a Saturday. Patricia had the day off. Daniel had finished a job the day before and didn't need to be at the marina until Monday. They decided to take a drive. Nothing elaborate. Just a trip down the coast, maybe stop for lunch somewhere, enjoy the day. Patricia's mother, Carol, spoke to her daughter that morning around 9. Patricia called from the apartment, cheerful, excited. She said they were heading out soon. She promised to stop by later in the week. Carol would replay that conversation in her mind for years. The lightness in her daughter's voice. The casual goodbye. The assumption that there would be more calls, more visits, more time. That was the last time anyone in the family heard Patricia's voice. Around 10:30 that morning, a neighbor saw Daniel and Patricia getting into their car, a small, tan sedan, a few years old but well kept. Patricia was wearing a yellow sundress. Daniel had on jeans and a t-shirt. They were laughing about something. The neighbor waved. They waved back. The car pulled out of the apartment complex and turned south, toward the coastal highway. And then, they were gone. At first, no one was worried. By Sunday evening, when Patricia didn't call her mother as usual, Carol felt a small flutter of concern. But young people were forgetful. Maybe they'd decided to stay somewhere overnight. Maybe they'd lost track of time. By Monday morning, when Daniel didn't show up for work at the marina, his supervisor tried calling the apartment. No answer. He tried again an hour later. Still nothing. By Monday afternoon, Patricia's mother drove to the apartment. She knocked on the door. No response. She peered through the windows. The lights were off. Everything looked still. She felt the first real surge of fear. She called the police. The Cocoa Beach Police Department sent an officer to the apartment. He knocked, waited, then entered with the landlord's permission. Inside, everything was in order. The bed was made. Dishes were washed and put away. There were no signs of struggle, no signs of hurry. It looked like two people had simply walked out intending to come back. But they hadn't. On the kitchen counter, police found Patricia's purse. Inside were her wallet, her ID, a small amount of cash. On the dresser in the bedroom was Daniel's watch, the one his father had given him for his 21st birthday. He never went anywhere without it. Their car was gone. But they had left behind things they would have needed. The officer took a report. He assured Carol that most missing persons cases involving adults resolved themselves within a day or two. Young couples sometimes took spontaneous trips. Sometimes they had arguments and needed space. He said not to panic yet. But Carol knew her daughter. And she knew something was wrong. The search began in earnest on Tuesday morning. Police issued a bulletin for the tan sedan. They interviewed neighbors, co-workers, friends. Had anyone seen the Mitchells after Saturday morning? Did they mention where they were going? Had there been any problems in the marriage, any financial trouble, any reason they might have left voluntarily? Everyone said the same thing. Daniel and Patricia were happy. They were in love. They didn't have enemies. They didn't owe money. They didn't use drugs. They were just normal. Good people starting a life together. The marina supervisor told police that Daniel was reliable, never missed work, never caused problems. The florist shop owner said Patricia was sweet, eager to learn, always on time. Their friends described them as kind, maybe a little naive, but genuinely good-hearted. No one could think of a single reason why they would disappear. By Wednesday, volunteers from the community joined the search. They walked the beaches, combed through wooded areas near the highway, checked abandoned buildings. Local news stations ran stories. Patricia's photo appeared on the evening news, her wedding photo, smiling in her white dress, Daniel beside her. Tips started coming in. Someone thought they saw the car near Titusville. Someone else reported a couple matching their description at a gas station in Melbourne. Police followed up on every lead. None of them went anywhere. Days turned into a week. A week turned into 2. And then, on April 27, a fisherman made a discovery that confirmed everyone's worst fear. He was out early, just after dawn, near a secluded inlet south of Cocoa Beach. The area was mostly mangroves and shallow water, not a popular spot, but good for certain types of fish. He was wading near the shore when he saw something pale beneath the surface, caught in the roots. It was a body. Police were called immediately. By mid-morning, divers had recovered the remains. It was a young woman, partially decomposed, but still identifiable. She was wearing a yellow sundress. It was Patricia Mitchell. The news hit the community like a physical blow. For 2 weeks, people had held on to hope. Maybe the Mitchells had run away together. Maybe they'd had an accident but were still alive somewhere. Maybe this was all a terrible misunderstanding. But now, there was a body. And hope began to collapse. The medical examiner worked quickly. Patricia had been strangled. There were bruises on her neck, evidence of a sustained, violent struggle. She had been in the water for approximately 2 weeks, consistent with the timeline of her disappearance. There was no evidence of sexual assault. Her clothes were intact. Her wedding ring was still on her finger. She had been killed and dumped in the water shortly after she vanished. But where was Daniel? Search efforts intensified. Divers combed the inlet and surrounding waterways. Volunteers spread out across miles of coastline. Helicopters flew low over the marshes. Everyone was looking for the tan sedan, for Daniel's body, for anything that would explain what had happened. The Brevard County Sheriff's Office took over the investigation. Detectives began working the case full-time. They retraced the Mitchells' last known movements. They re-interviewed everyone who had seen them that Saturday morning. The neighbor who had waved goodbye remembered something new. She said that as the car pulled away, she thought she saw another person in the back seat. She wasn't sure. It had been quick, just a glimpse. But maybe there had been someone else with them. Detectives pressed her. Could she describe the person? She couldn't. It was just a shadow, a shape. She wasn't even certain it was a person. It could have been a bag, a jacket, a trick of the light. But it was something. In early May, a breakthrough. A retired couple, driving south toward Fort Pierce, stopped at a rest area off Highway 1. The husband went to use the restroom. When he came back out, he noticed something odd in the far corner of the parking lot, near the tree line. It was a car, tan, covered in pollen and dirt, like it had been sitting there for a while. He walked over. The car was unlocked. The keys were in the ignition. The interior was clean, almost too clean. There were no personal belongings, no trash, nothing. It looked like it had been wiped down. He checked the glove compartment. Inside was a vehicle registration. The car belonged to Daniel Mitchell. Police arrived within the hour. They processed the vehicle carefully. There were no fingerprints, not on the steering wheel, not on the door handles, not on the keys. Someone had cleaned it thoroughly. But in the trunk, investigators found something. Faint bloodstains. Not much, but enough to test. The blood was Patricia's. That confirmed it. She had been killed, placed in the trunk of her own car, and driven to the inlet where her body was found. The car had then been abandoned at the rest area, wiped clean, and left behind. But there was still no sign of Daniel. Detectives began to consider two possibilities. 1. Daniel had been killed as well, and his body simply hadn't been found yet. 2. Daniel had killed his wife and disappeared. The idea that Daniel Mitchell might be responsible seemed impossible to most people who knew him. His family was devastated by the suggestion. His father, a quiet man who worked in construction, told police that his son wasn't capable of violence. His mother wept and insisted that Daniel loved Patricia, that he would never hurt her. Friends echoed the same sentiment. Daniel was gentle, soft-spoken, non-confrontational. But investigators had to follow the evidence. They dug into Daniel's background. No criminal record. No history of domestic violence. No complaints, no arrests, not even a traffic ticket. His co-workers described him as dependable and easygoing. His friends said he seemed genuinely happy in his marriage. Still, statistically, when a young woman is murdered, the husband or boyfriend is often involved. Detectives interviewed Patricia's family and friends, looking for any sign of trouble in the marriage. Had Patricia ever mentioned arguments? Had she seemed afraid? Had Daniel ever been controlling, jealous, angry? No. Nothing. Patricia's mother, Carol, was adamant. Her daughter had been happy. She would have said something if Daniel had ever hurt her. Carol was certain of it. But certainty doesn't solve cases. Weeks passed. Then months. Searches continued sporadically, but there was no trace of Daniel Mitchell. No body. No sightings. No activity on his bank account or credit cards. It was as if he had evaporated. By the end of summer, the case had gone cold. The official theory, at least the one that seemed most plausible to investigators, was that Daniel and Patricia had been attacked by someone, possibly someone who had been hiding in their car or who had approached them somewhere along their route. Patricia had been killed. Daniel had either been killed and disposed of in a way that made his body unrecoverable, or he had managed to escape and was too traumatized or frightened to come forward. But there was another theory, quieter, whispered in the sheriff's office and among certain detectives. That Daniel had killed Patricia, staged the scene to look like a third-party crime, and then disappeared to start a new life somewhere far away. It was a theory based on circumstance, not evidence. And without a body, without a witness, without a confession, there was nothing to pursue. The case file was marked inactive. Patricia's family held a funeral. They buried her in a small cemetery near her childhood home. Her mother placed flowers on the grave every week. Daniel's family waited, hoping their son would come home, hoping he was alive somewhere, hoping for any kind of answer. But the years went by, and the answers never came. By 1990, most people in Cocoa Beach had stopped talking about the Mitchells. The case would come up occasionally, usually when someone new moved to town and heard the story. There would be a brief moment of curiosity, a few questions, and then it would fade again. It became one of those local tragedies that people referenced but didn't dwell on. A sad story. A mystery. Something that happened a long time ago. Patricia's mother never stopped. She kept a box of newspaper clippings, photos, police reports. She called the sheriff's office every few months, asking if there had been any progress. The answer was always the same. No new leads. No new evidence. The case was still open, technically, but no one was actively working it. Carol grew older. Her hair turned gray. Her health began to decline. But she never let go of the need to know what had happened to her daughter. In 1998, she was diagnosed with cancer. She fought it for 2 years. In her final weeks, lying in a hospital bed, she told her remaining family members that her greatest regret was not knowing the truth. She had buried her daughter without understanding why. She had spent 15 years wondering if the man her daughter married had killed her, or if some stranger had taken her away. She died without answers. Her funeral was quiet. A handful of family members. A few old friends. And in the back of the room, unnoticed by most, a man in his late 30s, wearing a dark suit, standing alone. He stayed only a few minutes. He didn't approach the family. He didn't sign the guest book. He watched from a distance, and then he left. No one knew who he was. It would be another decade before the case moved again. In 2008, the Brevard County Sheriff's Office hired a new investigator, a detective named Robert Hargrove. He was in his early 50s, a veteran of the department, known for his methodical approach and his refusal to let go of difficult cases. He had a reputation for reviewing old files, looking for things other people had missed. In the fall of 2008, Hargrove was assigned to review a backlog of cold cases. He came across the Mitchell file. He read through it carefully. The initial reports. The witness statements. The forensic analysis. The dead ends. Something bothered him. The car had been found wiped clean. That suggested premeditation, or at least an attempt to cover up evidence. But the body had been dumped in a relatively accessible location, where it was likely to be found. That suggested panic, or carelessness. Those two things didn't quite fit together. Hargrove decided to re-interview some of the original witnesses, the people who had known the Mitchells, the neighbors, the co-workers. Most of them were still in the area. Some had moved away. A few had died. But one person stood out in the file. A man named Eric Dalton. He had been a friend of Daniel's, someone who had worked at the marina around the same time. He had been interviewed briefly in 1985, and he'd said he didn't know anything. He hadn't seen Daniel in the days before the disappearance. He didn't know of any problems. He couldn't offer any leads. His statement had been noted and filed away. But Hargrove noticed something. Dalton had left his job at the marina just a few weeks after the Mitchells disappeared. He'd moved out of state. He'd come back to Florida years later, settled in a different town, and had been living quietly ever since. Hargrove decided to pay him a visit. Eric Dalton was 51 years old in 2008. He lived in a small house in Palm Bay, about 20 miles south of Cocoa Beach. He worked in construction. He was married, had 2 teenage kids. He kept to himself, didn't cause trouble, didn't draw attention. When Hargrove knocked on his door one afternoon in October, Dalton seemed surprised but not alarmed. He invited the detective in. They sat in the living room. Dalton's wife brought them coffee. Hargrove explained that he was reviewing old cases, and that Dalton's name had come up in the Mitchell file. He asked if Dalton remembered Daniel and Patricia. Dalton nodded. He said he remembered. He said it was a terrible thing, what had happened to them. He said he'd always wondered what became of Daniel. Hargrove asked him to walk through what he remembered from that time. Where had he been working? How well had he known Daniel? Dalton said he and Daniel had been friendly, but not close. They worked different shifts mostly. They'd grab a beer once in a while, talk about boats, sports, nothing serious. Hargrove asked if he remembered the last time he saw Daniel. Dalton thought for a moment. He said it must have been a few days before the disappearance. Maybe that Thursday or Friday. He couldn't remember exactly. Hargrove nodded. He asked if Dalton had noticed anything unusual about Daniel's behavior around that time. Did he seem stressed? Worried? Excited? Dalton said no. Daniel seemed normal. Hargrove asked why Dalton had left the marina so soon after the Mitchells vanished. Dalton shifted in his seat. He said it wasn't related. He said he'd gotten a better job offer in Georgia. He said the timing was just coincidence. Hargrove didn't push. He thanked Dalton for his time. He left his card. He said if Dalton remembered anything else, to give him a call. As Hargrove walked back to his car, he had a feeling. Nothing concrete. Nothing he could write in a report. Just a sense that Dalton had been uncomfortable. That something about the conversation had rattled him. Hargrove decided to dig deeper. Over the next several weeks, Hargrove quietly investigated Eric Dalton. He pulled Dalton's employment records. He reviewed his financial history. He talked to people who had known him in the 1980s. He looked for any connection, any overlap, any reason Dalton might have been more involved than he'd admitted. What he found was a pattern. In 1985, shortly after the Mitchells disappeared, Dalton had quit his job, left Florida, and moved to Georgia. He'd worked there for about 3 years, then moved to South Carolina. Then back to Florida, but to a different town. He'd changed jobs frequently. He'd moved around a lot. That wasn't necessarily suspicious. Plenty of people moved for work. But it was notable. Hargrove also found something else. In 1999, Dalton had been questioned by police in connection with a domestic violence incident. His then-girlfriend had accused him of choking her during an argument. She later recanted, said it was a misunderstanding, and no charges were filed. But the report was in the system. Hargrove felt the pieces starting to shift. He went back through the original Mitchell case file, looking for any mention of Dalton beyond that single brief interview. There wasn't much. But there was one detail that caught his attention. The neighbor who thought she'd seen someone in the back seat of the Mitchells' car had described a vague shape. She couldn't identify the person. But she'd said it was someone with dark hair, average build. Eric Dalton had dark hair. Average build. It was thin. It was circumstantial. But it was something. Hargrove decided to approach Dalton again, but this time with a different strategy. In early December 2008, he called Dalton and asked if he'd be willing to come down to the station to answer a few more questions. Hargrove said it was routine, just trying to tie up loose ends on the Mitchell case. He said it would only take a few minutes. Dalton agreed. He came in on a weekday afternoon. He seemed calm, maybe a little curious. Hargrove met him in a small interview room. He offered coffee. He made small talk. He kept the tone light, friendly. Then he started asking questions. He asked Dalton to go through his relationship with Daniel again. How did they meet? How often did they hang out? Did Dalton ever spend time with Daniel and Patricia together? Dalton said he'd met Patricia once or twice, but didn't really know her. He said he and Daniel weren't that close. Hargrove asked if Dalton had ever been to the Mitchells' apartment. Dalton hesitated. Then he said no, he didn't think so. Hargrove asked if Dalton owned a car in 1985. Dalton said yes, an old pickup truck. Hargrove asked if he'd ever given Daniel or Patricia a ride anywhere. Dalton said no. Hargrove paused. He let the silence sit for a moment. Then he said, quietly, that he'd been reviewing the case file, and he'd noticed some inconsistencies. He said he wasn't accusing Dalton of anything, but he wanted to clear up a few things. Dalton's expression changed. Just slightly. A tightness around his eyes. Hargrove asked again, had Dalton ever been in the Mitchells' car? Dalton said no. Hargrove asked if Dalton had any idea who might have wanted to hurt Daniel or Patricia. Dalton said no. Hargrove asked if Dalton had anything he wanted to tell him. Anything at all. Dalton stared at him for a long moment. Then he said he didn't know what Hargrove was getting at. He said he'd answered all these questions years ago. He said if there was nothing else, he'd like to go. Hargrove let him leave. But he made a note in his file. Subject became defensive when pressed. Possible knowledge of events. Over the next year, Hargrove continued working the case quietly. He didn't have enough evidence to arrest Dalton. He didn't even have enough to get a warrant. But he kept digging. He talked to more people. He reviewed old maps, trying to reconstruct routes the Mitchells might have taken that Saturday. He looked for connections between Dalton and the locations where Patricia's body and the car had been found. And then, in the spring of 2009, something unexpected happened. Dalton's wife filed for divorce. It wasn't unusual. Marriages end. But Hargrove heard about it through the grapevine. One of the deputies mentioned it in passing, and it struck him as potentially significant. Divorce often brings secrets to the surface. People talk when relationships fall apart. They say things they've kept buried for years. Hargrove reached out to Dalton's wife, a woman named Karen. He asked if she'd be willing to talk to him, off the record, about her husband. She agreed to meet. They sat in a coffee shop in Melbourne. Karen was in her late 40s, tired-looking, worn down. She said the marriage had been difficult for a long time. She said Eric had always been moody, secretive, prone to sudden anger. She said she'd stayed because of the kids, but now that they were almost grown, she couldn't do it anymore. Hargrove asked if Eric had ever mentioned Daniel or Patricia Mitchell. Karen said no. Not that she could remember. Hargrove asked if Eric had ever talked about his time working at the marina in the 1980s. Karen said he didn't talk much about his past at all. He didn't like talking about anything from before they met. Hargrove asked if she'd ever felt afraid of him. Karen looked down at her coffee. She said yes. Sometimes. Hargrove asked if Eric had ever hurt her. She nodded. She said it had happened a few times over the years. Nothing that sent her to the hospital. But enough to scare her. Hargrove asked if she knew anything about Eric that might help with an old case. Karen said she didn't know anything specific. But she said there was something about Eric that had always bothered her. She said he had nightmares. She said sometimes he'd wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, shaking. She said once, years ago, he'd woken up and said a name. A woman's name. Hargrove's heart rate picked up. He asked what name. Karen said she couldn't remember exactly. It had been a long time ago. But she thought it was something like Patricia. Or Tricia. Something like that. Hargrove felt the case shift again. In the summer of 2009, Hargrove decided it was time to confront Dalton directly. He knew he didn't have enough for an arrest. But he believed Dalton knew something. And he believed that if he applied the right kind of pressure, Dalton might crack. He called Dalton and asked him to come back to the station. This time, Dalton was reluctant. He asked why. Hargrove said there were new developments in the Mitchell case. He said Dalton's name had come up again. He said it would be in Dalton's best interest to come in and talk. Dalton said he'd think about it. A week later, he showed up. He looked different. Thinner. Older. Stressed. The divorce was clearly taking a toll. Hargrove brought him into an interview room. This time, there was another detective present, a younger investigator named Lisa Brennan. She sat quietly, taking notes. Hargrove started with the same questions. But this time, he added new information. He mentioned that they'd been talking to people who knew Dalton in 1985. He said some interesting details had emerged. He said he knew Dalton had been closer to Daniel than he'd admitted. Dalton denied it. Hargrove said they had a witness who remembered seeing Dalton at the Mitchell's apartment around the time of the disappearance. Dalton said the witness was mistaken. Hargrove said they had reason to believe Dalton had been in the Mitchell's car. Dalton's face went pale. Hargrove leaned forward. He said, quietly, that he understood that sometimes things happen that people don't plan. That sometimes situations get out of control. That carrying a secret for 24 years is a heavy burden. Dalton didn't respond. Hargrove said that if Dalton knew something, now was the time to say it. That the truth always comes out eventually. That it would be better to tell it now, on his own terms. Dalton sat in silence for a long time. Then he said he wanted a lawyer. The interview ended. Hargrove knew that requesting a lawyer didn't necessarily mean guilt. But it was a sign that Dalton understood he was in serious trouble. Over the next several months, Hargrove and his team worked to build a stronger case. They re-interviewed the neighbor who thought she'd seen someone in the back seat. They showed her a photo lineup that included Dalton. She couldn't make a positive identification. But she didn't rule him out either. They tracked down other people who had worked at the marina in 1985. A few remembered Dalton. One recalled that Dalton had seemed off in the weeks after the Mitchells disappeared. Another said Dalton had abruptly stopped coming to the bar where the marina workers used to hang out. None of it was definitive. But it was building. Then, in early 2010, Hargrove caught a break. He received a call from a woman named Janet Russo. She said she'd been following the news about the Mitchell case being reopened. She said she had information. She said that in 1985, she had been dating Eric Dalton. Hargrove met with her immediately. Janet was in her late 40s now, living in Jacksonville. She said she and Eric had dated for about 6 months in 1985. She said he'd been charming at first, but over time she'd realized he had a temper. She said they'd broken up in May of that year, right around the time Eric left for Georgia. She said she hadn't thought much about it at the time. But looking back, she realized the timing was strange. Hargrove asked if Eric had ever mentioned Daniel or Patricia Mitchell. Janet said yes. She said Eric had mentioned Daniel a few times. She said they worked together. She said Eric seemed to admire Daniel in a weird way. Like he was jealous of him. Hargrove asked what she meant. Janet said Eric had once said something like, "Some guys have all the luck. Good job, pretty wife, no worries." She said it had stuck with her because Eric had sounded bitter when he said it. Hargrove asked if Eric had ever talked about Patricia specifically. Janet hesitated. Then she said yes. She said one time, maybe a week or two before the Mitchells disappeared, Eric had mentioned running into Daniel and Patricia at a grocery store. He'd said Patricia was beautiful. He'd said it in a way that made Janet uncomfortable. Hargrove asked if Eric had ever said anything about the day the Mitchells vanished. Janet said no. But she said something strange had happened a few days after they disappeared. She said Eric had shown up at her apartment late at night, unannounced. He'd seemed agitated, almost panicked. He'd asked if he could stay with her for a few days. She'd said no, they'd been fighting, and she didn't want him there. He'd left, and she hadn't seen him again until weeks later, right before he moved away. Hargrove asked if she'd told police about this in 1985. Janet said no. She said she hadn't made the connection at the time. She said she'd only started thinking about it recently, after hearing that the case was being looked at again. Hargrove thanked her. He added her statement to the growing file. In March 2010, Hargrove decided he had enough to bring Dalton in for a formal interrogation. He coordinated with the state attorney's office. They agreed that while the evidence was largely circumstantial, the accumulation of details, Dalton's proximity to the victims, his sudden departure from the area, his behavior in the weeks after the crime, the domestic violence history, the statements from his ex-wife and ex-girlfriend, justified bringing him in under suspicion. On a Tuesday morning, detectives arrived at Dalton's home with a warrant to bring him in for questioning. Dalton was at work. They found him at a construction site. He didn't resist. He looked resigned, almost relieved. They brought him to the sheriff's office. This time, the interview room was equipped with recording equipment. Everything would be documented. Hargrove and Brennan sat across from Dalton. They read him his rights. Dalton waived his right to a lawyer. He said he wanted to talk. Hargrove started slowly. He asked Dalton to tell them, in his own words, what had happened in April 1985. Dalton sat quietly for a long time. Then he started to speak. He said he'd been struggling back then. He said his life wasn't going the way he wanted. He said he'd been drinking too much, feeling angry all the time. He said he saw Daniel, young, happy, newly married, and it made something twist inside him. He said one Saturday morning, he'd driven past the Mitchell's apartment, not really planning anything, just driving. He said he saw them getting into their car. He said, on impulse, he pulled over and called out to Daniel. He said he asked if they were heading anywhere fun, maybe he could tag along. He said Daniel, being friendly, had said sure. Dalton said he got into the back seat. They drove south, down the coast. Daniel and Patricia were talking, laughing. Dalton sat in the back, quiet, watching them. He said something in him started to build. A resentment. A jealousy. He said he started thinking about how easy their lives seemed, how unfair it was. He said they stopped at a quiet spot near the water, just to stretch their legs, look at the view. And that's when it happened. Dalton said he didn't plan it. He said it just came over him. He said he grabbed Patricia from behind while Daniel was a few feet away, looking at the ocean. He said he put his hands around her neck. He said Patricia struggled. He said Daniel turned and saw what was happening and tried to pull him off. They fought. Dalton said he was bigger, stronger. He said he didn't mean to kill her. He said he just wanted to scare her, to feel powerful for a moment. But he didn't let go. When Patricia stopped moving, Daniel was screaming, trying to call for help. Dalton said he panicked. He said he hit Daniel, hard, with a piece of driftwood he'd picked up. He said Daniel went down. He said he thought Daniel was just unconscious. He said he dragged Patricia's body to the car, put her in the trunk. He said he went back for Daniel. But Daniel was gone. Dalton said he looked around, frantic, but he couldn't find him. He said he thought maybe Daniel had run off, maybe gone to get help. He said he panicked completely. He said he got in the car and drove. He said he dumped Patricia's body in the inlet, hoping it wouldn't be found, or at least not for a long time. He said he wiped down the car, left it at the rest stop, and hitchhiked back to Cocoa Beach. He said he grabbed his things and left Florida that same week. He said he never saw Daniel again. He said he didn't know what happened to him. Hargrove asked if Dalton thought Daniel was alive. Dalton said he didn't know. He said he'd always assumed Daniel had died somewhere, maybe drowned, maybe collapsed from his injuries and was never found. He said he'd spent 25 years wondering. Hargrove asked why Dalton had never come forward. Dalton said he was afraid. He said at first, he thought he could just disappear, start over. He said as time went on, it became harder to confess. He said he built a new life, got married, had kids. He said he tried to bury it. But he said it never went away. He said he thought about Patricia every day. He said he saw her face in his nightmares. He said he knew what he'd done was unforgivable. Hargrove asked if Dalton was willing to put this in writing. Dalton nodded. He signed a full confession. The arrest was made official on March 16, 2010. Eric Dalton was charged with the murder of Patricia Mitchell and the suspected murder of Daniel Mitchell, though Daniel's body had never been recovered. The news spread quickly through Brevard County and beyond. For people who remembered the case, it was shocking. For younger residents who had never heard of the Mitchells, it was a grim reminder that the past never fully disappears. Patricia's surviving family members, her siblings, her cousins, a few close friends, were notified before the press conference. They were told that after 25 years, there was finally an answer. Patricia's brother, Michael, spoke to reporters outside the sheriff's office. He was in his 50s now, graying, his voice thick with emotion. He said his family had never stopped hoping for justice. He said his mother had died not knowing who killed her daughter. He said he wished she could have lived to see this day. He said it didn't bring Patricia back. But it meant something. It meant her life had mattered. It meant the person responsible hadn't gotten away with it. If you believe Patricia deserved someone to keep pushing for the truth, hit that subscribe button. Trolls won't. But people who understand that some stories need to be told, they will. Because these aren't just cases. They're lives that were stolen. And the least we can do is make sure they're remembered. In the weeks following Dalton's arrest, investigators worked to corroborate his confession. They retraced his account of the crime. They returned to the area where Dalton said the murder had occurred, a secluded stretch of beach south of Cocoa Beach, accessible by a dirt road that had been largely forgotten over the years. The land had changed. Development had crept in. But the basic geography was still recognizable. Divers searched the nearby waters, hoping to find any trace of Daniel Mitchell. They combed through mangroves, searched shallow inlets, dragged sections of the ocean floor. They found nothing. Forensic teams examined the car again, using more advanced techniques than had been available in 1985. They found additional traces of blood in the trunk, consistent with Dalton's account. They found fibers that matched clothing Patricia had been wearing. They also found something else, a single hair, caught in the trunk latch, that didn't belong to Patricia. DNA testing confirmed it was Eric Dalton's. It wasn't definitive proof on its own. Dalton could have argued that he'd been in the car at some point for innocent reasons. But combined with his confession, it was damning. Dalton's defense attorney, a court-appointed public defender named Robert Keene, tried to argue that the confession had been coerced, that Dalton had been under emotional duress due to his divorce, that he'd been manipulated by detectives who had no real evidence. But the recording of the interrogation showed otherwise. Dalton had been calm. He'd waived his rights voluntarily. He'd provided details that only the killer would know. The state attorney's office moved forward with the prosecution. The trial began in October 2010, more than 25 years after Patricia Mitchell's death. The courthouse in Viera, Florida, was packed. Family members filled the front rows. Reporters lined the back. Members of the community who remembered the case came to watch. It was one of the most closely followed trials in Brevard County in years. The prosecution laid out the case methodically. They presented the timeline. They showed the jury photos of Patricia and Daniel, young and smiling, on their wedding day. They described the search efforts in 1985, the discovery of Patricia's body, the abandoned car. They introduced the forensic evidence, the blood, the hair, the wiped-down interior. They played the recording of Dalton's confession. The courtroom was silent as Dalton's voice filled the room, describing how he had killed Patricia, how he had struck Daniel, how he had panicked and run. The defense tried to argue that the confession was unreliable. They suggested that Dalton had confessed to a crime he didn't commit out of guilt, confusion, or a desire to end the investigation. They pointed out that Daniel's body had never been found, that there was no physical evidence directly linking Dalton to the scene of the crime, that the case relied heavily on Dalton's own words. But the prosecution countered with the weight of circumstantial evidence. Dalton's behavior in 1985. His abrupt departure from Florida. His history of violence. The statements from his ex-wife and ex-girlfriend. The DNA evidence. And most powerfully, the emotional testimony of those who had known Patricia. Her brother Michael took the stand. He described his sister as kind, full of life, someone who had never hurt anyone. He said her death had destroyed their family. He said his mother had spent the last 15 years of her life consumed by grief and unanswered questions. He looked directly at Dalton and said, "You took everything from us." Dalton, sitting at the defense table, didn't look up. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On November 4, 2010, they returned a verdict. Guilty. Eric Dalton was convicted of second-degree murder in the death of Patricia Mitchell. The charge was second-degree rather than first-degree because the prosecution couldn't prove premeditation. Dalton's own confession suggested the murder had been impulsive, driven by sudden rage rather than a calculated plan. He was also convicted of manslaughter in the suspected death of Daniel Mitchell, based on his admission that he had struck Daniel and left him injured, likely leading to his death. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. When the day came, the courtroom was once again filled. The judge, a woman in her early 60s named Sandra Whitmore, listened as the prosecution argued for the maximum sentence. They said Dalton had shown no remorse for 25 years. They said he had built a life while Patricia's family suffered. They said he deserved to spend the rest of his life in prison. The defense argued for leniency. They said Dalton had finally done the right thing by confessing. They said he had cooperated fully with the investigation. They said he was now in his 50s, that he had health problems, that a lengthy sentence would effectively be a life sentence. Judge Whitmore considered both arguments. Then she spoke. She said that while Dalton's confession had been valuable in bringing closure to the case, it did not erase the severity of his actions. She said he had taken 2 lives, one definitively, one almost certainly. She said he had robbed a family of their daughter and sister. She said he had spent 25 years in freedom while Patricia lay in a grave. She sentenced him to 40 years in prison for the murder of Patricia Mitchell and an additional 15 years for the manslaughter of Daniel Mitchell, to be served consecutively. 55 years total. At 51 years old, Eric Dalton would likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. In the days after the sentencing, the story made national news. It was featured on true crime programs, in newspapers, on websites dedicated to cold cases. The headline was always some variation of the same theme: Florida cold case solved after 25 years, killer confesses. For the people of Brevard County, it was a reminder that justice, even delayed, still mattered. For Patricia's family, it was bittersweet. Michael Mitchell, Patricia's brother, gave one final interview after the sentencing. He stood outside the courthouse, flanked by other family members. He said they were grateful to Detective Hargrove and his team. He said they were grateful that someone had cared enough to keep looking, even after all these years. But he also said it didn't bring Patricia back. He said his sister had been 21 years old when she died. She'd been married for 3 months. She'd had her whole life ahead of her. He said his mother had died without seeing justice. He said the victory felt hollow in some ways, but necessary in others. He said, at least now, people know the truth. At least now, Patricia's name isn't just attached to a mystery. It's attached to a person who mattered. The cameras clicked. The reporters wrote it down. And then, slowly, the story began to fade from the news cycle. But for those who had lived through it, the story never really ended. In the years that followed, Detective Robert Hargrove received several awards for his work on the Mitchell case. He was recognized by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. He was profiled in a law enforcement journal. He was invited to speak at conferences about cold case investigations. But in private, he said the recognition wasn't what mattered. What mattered, he said, was that he'd been able to give a family some answers. What mattered was that a killer had been held accountable. He retired from the Brevard County Sheriff's Office in 2015, after more than 30 years of service. He said the Mitchell case was one of the ones that stayed with him. Not because it was the most violent. Not because it was the most complex. But because it was proof that time doesn't erase the truth. Eric Dalton remained in prison. He gave no further interviews. He made no public statements. His ex-wife and children distanced themselves from him entirely. His name became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what jealousy and rage can do. And Daniel Mitchell's body was never found. Over the years, there were occasional searches, driven by tips or new theories. Divers explored different areas. Volunteers combed through wooded regions. But the ocean and the land kept their secrets. Patricia's family held memorial services on the anniversaries of her death. They visited her grave. They spoke her name. They refused to let her be forgotten. And in a quiet way, that was its own form of justice. There are some questions this case leaves behind that will never be answered. Where is Daniel Mitchell's body? Did he die immediately from his injuries, or did he suffer, alone and afraid, somewhere no one could find him? Did he try to get help? Did he think about Patricia in his final moments? We'll never know. What we do know is this. On a Saturday morning in April 1985, 2 young people left their apartment expecting to enjoy a beautiful day. They were newlyweds, barely into their 20s, full of hope and plans. They trusted someone who seemed friendly. They let him into their car. And that trust cost them everything. For 25 years, their story was a mystery. For 25 years, a killer walked free, building a life, raising a family, pretending the past didn't exist. But the past never disappears. It waits. And sometimes, if enough people care, if someone is willing to keep asking questions, if the weight of a secret becomes too heavy to carry, sometimes, the truth comes out. In 2010, 25 years after Patricia and Daniel Mitchell vanished, the truth finally emerged. It didn't bring them back. It didn't undo the years of pain their families endured. But it meant that Patricia's death was no longer a mystery. It meant that the person responsible was held accountable. It meant that even after a quarter of a century, justice was still possible. And that matters. It matters to the families who refuse to give up. It matters to the investigators who won't let a case go cold in their hearts, even when the file is marked inactive. It matters to the communities that remember, that refuse to forget the people who were taken from them. And it should matter to all of us. As I finish telling you this story, I want you to think about what it means to wait 25 years for an answer. Think about Patricia's mother, calling the sheriff's office month after month, year after year, knowing that the person who killed her daughter was out there somewhere, living a life, while her daughter was in the ground. Think about Michael, Patricia's brother, growing older, watching his mother die without closure, carrying the weight of unanswered questions for most of his adult life. Think about Daniel's family, never knowing where their son was, never able to bury him, never able to say goodbye. And then think about the moment when Detective Hargrove knocked on Eric Dalton's door and refused to let the case stay buried. Think about the moment when Dalton finally said the words that had been locked inside him for 25 years. Think about the moment when a family, broken and grieving, finally heard the truth. That's what justice looks like when it's delayed. It's not triumphant. It's not celebratory. It's quiet and painful and necessary. It's the difference between a story that ends in silence and a story that ends in truth. And truth, even when it comes late, is worth fighting for. Patricia Mitchell was 21 years old when she died. She loved flowers. She had a laugh that filled rooms. She was building a life with someone she loved. Daniel Mitchell was 23. He was steady, kind, the sort of person people trusted. He was looking forward to a future that never came. Their lives mattered. Their deaths mattered. And the fact that someone finally answered for what happened to them, that matters too. Rest in peace, Patricia. Rest in peace, Daniel. You were not forgotten. These stories are for people who believe the human spirit doesn't break, even after decades of silence. People like that don't look away. If you stayed with this story until the end, you're someone who understands that truth doesn't have an expiration date. That justice, even when it's slow, even when it's painful, is still worth pursuing. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, like, and share this with someone you know who values stories like this. Because every time we tell these stories, we're doing more than recounting the past. We're making sure that the victims are remembered. We're holding space for the families who never stopped fighting. We're reminding the world that some things, truth, justice, memory, are worth the wait. I'll see you in the next one.